At 20 years old, Silas Crowder owned exactly three things in the world: a canvas duffel bag with 2 pairs of jeans, 4 shirts gone soft at the collar, and 1 good wool coat. His last foster mother had pressed that coat into his arms the winter before the cancer took her. A second-hand work knife in a leather sheath worn pale along the spine. And the funeral program from his mother's burial, folded 8 times into a square no bigger than a matchbook. He had carried it in the right back pocket of every pair of jeans for 8 years. He had $93 when the bus left Pikeville that March. By the time the courthouse was his, he had $73.40. That was the morning everything turned. But the turning didn't look like much from the outside. It looked like a thin young man in a borrowed truck, signing a paper he did not read, in front of people who had already decided what he was. To understand why a county would sell a whole building for the price of a sandwich, we have to go back to the morning before. We have to go back to the shelter and the notice taped to the door. The light came up gray over Pikeville at 6:47 that morning. It came up gray most mornings in that part of eastern Kentucky, where the hills hold the sun off the valleys until it is good and ready. Silas woke on a cot near the back wall of the Mount Calvary Outreach Shelter. He lay still for a while, counting the water stains on the ceiling, because counting things was a habit he had kept since he was small. It was a way to be somewhere without being anywhere. He had a system for waking up. Shoes on first, always before anyone else stirred. A man with his shoes on could leave. A man with his shoes off was waiting on somebody's permission. He checked the balance on his card at the gas station across the road. $78.40. 3 weeks since the lumberyard had cut his hours, and no new work on the board. On the way back in, he saw the notice taped to the shelter door. It was a county flyer printed crooked, the toner running thin at the bottom. Holland County Surplus Property Auction. 3 parcels, absolute sale, no minimum reserve on the third. Somebody had drawn a little spray of mountain laurel in the corner in blue pen, the way a person does when they are bored and the phone keeps ringing. The third parcel was listed as the old county courthouse. Condemned. As. Buyer assumes all liability. Silas read it the way he read everything, which was slowly, his lips moving a little before the words came clear. He had taught himself in the 6th grade to do it where nobody could see, turning his face to the window or the wall. Twice. Holland County. The name pulled at something far back. A brick building in the rain, a woman's hand on his shoulder, gone before he could hold it. He folded the flyer into his coat. The auction ran at 3:30 that afternoon in a strip mall annex the county rented next to a tax office. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead. The air smelled of burnt coffee and floor wax. Maybe 15 people sat in folding chairs, most of them there for the gravel pit on Parcel 2, men in good boots with checkbooks and opinions. The county attorney ran the gavel himself. His name was Garrett Pruitt, and he wore gold-rimmed glasses and a watch that caught the light when he raised his hand. He had the manner of a man who had never once in his life waited for an elevator. Parcel 1, the gravel pit, went for $9,200. Parcel 2, the hillside lot, went for $700. Then Pruitt looked down at his sheet, and something like amusement crossed his face. Parcel 3, he said. The old courthouse on Bramwell Creek, condemned in 2018 after the flood took the back roof. The county has carried the liability on it 7 years, and frankly we would pay somebody to take it. A few people laughed. Openings bids $5. Anybody dumb enough to want it, raise a hand. A woman near the front recrossed her legs. A man checked his phone. Pruitt let the silence sit, because the silence was the joke, and he was enjoying it. Silas raised his hand. Pruitt looked at him the way you look at a stray that has wandered into a nice yard. He took in the wool coat that did not match the jeans. He took in the boots that had belonged to somebody else first, and the duffel bag at the young man's feet because the young man had nowhere to leave it. He let the look last a second longer than kindness allowed. $5, Pruitt said, going once. Silas walked to the front and put a $5 bill on the table, flat, smoothed with his thumb. The clerk slid a deed and a liability waiver across to him and held out a pen. Silas seed where she pointed. He did not read it. He had learned long ago that reading slowly in front of people only gave them time to decide things about you. He had decided years ago not to give them that. You understand it's got no roof, the clerk said, not unkindly. And no water, no power, and the county won't be responsible if it falls on you. She stamped the deed, $73.40 left on the card now, after the 5 in the bus and 2 days of eating. He folded the deed into his coat next to the flyer and walked out into the long afternoon light. He borrowed a truck from a man named Bo Halsey, who ran a salvage and lumber yard outside Bramwell Creek. Bo had given Silas 3 days of cash work the month before. He didn't ask many questions. He looked at the deed, looked at Silas, and said only, "That old place. Huh." Then he handed over the keys to a Ford with a cracked windshield and 200,000 miles on it. Silas drove 11 miles east into Holland County with the windows down. The road followed a creek that ran high and brown with the spring rain. Coal trucks had cut the shoulders to mud. The hills closed in, on both sides, dark with bare hardwood not yet leafed out. Here and there a dogwood stood white against the gray timber, like something that had wandered in from another season. The courthouse sat at the end of Bramwell Creek's one main street, where the pavement gave out and the gravel began. It was bigger than he had pictured. Brick on the second story, sandstone at the base, an iron cupola gone the green of old pennies. Mountain laurel had grown up wild against the south wall and pushed in through a broken window. An old dogwood stood at the foot of the steps, full out the only living thing that looked like it belonged. He parked under the dogwood and shut the engine off and sat there a while. Above the doors, half-eaten by ivy, a brass plate read Holland County Courthouse, 1888. Silas climbed the steps with the deed in his hand. He stood on the landing a long time before he tried the door. He had not held the key to anything in 2 years. The knob was cold and loose in his palm. When he pushed, the door opened the way old doors open when they have stopped expecting anyone. Too easy. It swung wide on its own weight, as if it had been left unlatched a long time ago for somebody who was finally coming. The smell hit him first, mold and red clay and old paper. Under it, faint, the dry sweetness of pencil shavings, though he would not place that smell until much later. He stepped inside, and the door swung shut behind him. The main room ran the full depth of the building, 2 stories of dead space rising to where the back roof had been. Sun came down through the hole in long dusty shafts. A sycamore had taken root in the collapsed corner and grown up through the floor. One pale branch reached clear across the room and rested on the judge's bench, like a hand laid down to think. The bench was still there. That surprised him. A great slab of dark oak raised 3 steps above the floor, scarred and water-stained but whole. Behind it stood a tall chair, and behind the chair a door, shut, with a small brass plate gone green as the cupola. Silas crossed the room slow, watching where he put his feet. The floorboards near the sycamore had buckled, but the center held. He climbed the 3 steps to the bench and ran his hand along its top's edge. He felt the grain, the gouges, 100 small cuts, where pens had been pressed too hard over 100 years. He crouched and looked underneath, the way you check a thing to see if it is worth keeping. There, cut into the underside of the oak where no one would ever see it, somebody had carved 2 letters and a date with a pocket knife. The cuts were deep and uneven. They were the work of a hand that was shaking, or in the dark, or both. OW 794. Silas ran his thumb over it. A kid messing around, he figured. He stood up, brushed the clay off his knees, and looked at the locked door behind the bench. He did not yet know that he had just touched the first true thing in the building. He did not know that the man who carved it had sat in that tall chair for 37 years, carrying a grief he never carved anywhere else. He tried the locked door before he gave up on it that first night. The knob would not turn. There was a keyhole, old and double-warded, the kind that takes a key with real weight to it. Silas thought about forcing it. He had the knife, and the frame was soft with rot. But something in him would not do it. A locked door in a place that had been left to die meant somebody had wanted one room kept. He let it be. He spent that first night on the bench itself, the wool coat folded under his head, listening to the creak and the wind through the open roof. At 11:14, a coal train came through the crossing at the edge of town. The whole building hummed with it. The brass plate above the doors rang faint, and the floor trembled under him. Then it was gone, and the quiet came back deeper than before. He did not sleep much, but for the first time in 2 years, he slept somewhere that was his. He woke at first light to the smell of biscuits. A woman stood in the open doorway with a paper plate in her hand, watching him. She was small and square and old, 70 or more, in a man's flannel shirt and rubber boots, her gray hair pinned up off her neck. She did not come in. She stood at the threshold the way country people stand when they have decided to look at you a while before they decide anything else. When Silas sat up, she went still. "Lord," she said softly, almost to herself, "you look just like your mother." Silas didn't move. Vera had that same flat way of standing, like she was waiting on weather. The woman's eyes moved over his face, slow, reading it the way he read everything. "You're Vera Crowder's boy. I'd know that jaw anywhere. I sat next to your grandfather in the church choir 30 years, God rest him." "You knew my mother," Silas said. It came out rough. He had not said his mother's name to another living person in a long time. Knew her since she was knee-high. The woman climbed the steps and set the plate on the bench beside him. Biscuits and a smear of sausage gravy gone half cold from the walk. "Verla, pick it. I clerked in this courthouse 31 years till they shut it. Eat that before it sets up." Silas looked at the food and didn't touch it. People who gave you things usually wanted something. He had learned to wait and find out what. Verla seemed to know that too. She didn't push. She lowered herself onto the bench with a small grunt and looked out at the sycamore growing through the floor. She didn't say anything for a while. That was when Silas picked up a biscuit. "Why'd the county let it fall in like this?" he asked, around the food. "Cheaper to let it die than fix it. After the flood, they built a metal box out on the highway and called it the new courthouse." She made a sound in her throat. "Boxes don't remember anything. This place remembered everything. That was the trouble with it, far as some folks were concerned." "Whose initials are those, cut under the bench?" "O.W." Verla went quiet. Out at the crossing, a truck downshifted, and the sound rolled up the empty street. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It had gone careful, the way a voice goes when it steps around something. Judge knew what he was doing, carving that in his way. She stopped. She did not finish. She looked at her hands instead, at the knuckles, swollen with 73 years of weather and work. She let the sentence lie there unfinished between them, like something she had decided long ago not to pick all the way up. Silas waited, but she stood and brushed the front of her flannel, and the moment closed. "You'll want to test that foundation before you sleep under that roof another night," she said. "Sandstone like that, the flood gets in it. You can't always see the rot. Bo Halsey can show you how to read it. Tell him Verla sent you." She started for the door, then turned. "What's your name, son?" "Silas." She said it like she was setting it down somewhere safe. "All right then." And she went out into the morning, leaving the plate, and Silas sat alone on the dead judge's bench with his mother's name in the air for the first time in years. He spent the next days clearing the room. He hauled the rotten boards out by the armload. He stacked the salvage Bo could use and swept the clay and the bird mess down to bare floor. He found things as he went: a gavel with a cracked head, a row of brass coat hooks still screwed to the wall, a water-stained ledger of fines from 1931, the ink gone brown. He worked from first light until the sun dropped behind the ridge, because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to be. He slept on the bench. He washed in the creek, which ran cold enough to take his breath even in April. Bo loaned amp stove and a coil of extension cord run off a generator. Verla brought food more days than not, and Smoke learned the sound of the borrowed truck and would be waiting at the foot of the steps when it came up the gravel. Bo taught him things, the way a man teaches when he likes the company but won't say so. How to sister a rotten floor joist with a soundboard, glued and screwed, so the new wood carried the load the old wood had quit on. How to read the grain in a salvaged plank before you cut it, so the board didn't split on you. "Wood's got a memory," Bo said once, running his thumb along a length of oak. "It dried a certain way. You fight that, it fights back. You work with it, it'll do most anything." Silas filed that away too. It seemed to him true of more than wood. The dogwood out front dropped its blossoms by the second week, and the mountain laurel along the south wall came into its own, pink and white and thick with bees. The coal train still came through the crossing at 11:14 every night, and Silas had stopped jerking awake at it. He had started to wait for it instead. There was something steadying in a thing that came when it said it would. In the clerk's desk, among the dead pens and the rusted paper clips, he found a flat tin that had once held cough drops. Inside were pencils, a dozen of them, every one sharpened down to the exact same length, about the length of a man's hand from wrist to fingertip. None of them was a stub. None was new. They were all the same, as if somebody had measured. He showed the tin to Verla when she came by the next morning with coffee. She held one up and turned it in the light, and something crossed her face that was close to a smile and close to something sadder. That'd be the judge. He sharpened them down to the length of his hand, and the day a pencil got shorter than that, he threw it out. She set it back in the tin. Said a stub made a man write careless. Said if you couldn't grip it proper, you'd hurry, and hurrying was how mistakes got made in a room where mistakes followed a child their whole life. She closed the tin and handed it back to him. Keep those. He'd want them used. Bo Halsey came by that afternoon in his own truck with a hammer and a flashlight because Verla had called him. Verla was not a woman you said no to. He was a big man, 50 or so, gray-bearded, with forearms ruined by 40 years of lifting other people's discarded things. He walked the base of the building slow, tapping the sandstones, blofok with the back of the hammer, his head cocked to listen. You hear that? He rapped one block. It gave a clean, tight knock. He rapped the next, lower down near the old flood line. It came back dull, a flat thud with no ring under it. That's water in the stone. Hear how it goes, dead? Sound can't travel through wet rock the way it does through dry. He pressed his thumb to a dark seam where the mortar had gone soft. And look here, the face is darker. That's it wicking moisture up out of the ground. You find your good stone by tapping till you get that ring. Then you watch for the color change, and you put your hand flat and feel for cold. Wet stone holds the cold longer than dry. Silas crouched and put his palm flat against the block Bo had named. It was cold and faintly damp. The one above it was dry and rang when he knocked it. My daddy laid stone, his daddy before him. You don't get it from a book. Bo straightened, his knees cracking. Good news is your corner's gone, but your spine is sound. South wall and the front will hold. Whoever built this knew his trade. They quarried the sandstone right out of that ridge yonder, and they let it season 2 years before they set a block. Nobody waits 2 years for anything now. On the 4th day, in the bottom drawer of the old clerk's desk, swollen shut so he had to work it with the knife, Silas found the book. It was cloth-bound, the cover the dull red of dried blood, the spine cracked from use, stamped on the front in faded gold. Custody, Hull and Seal Family Court, BK 17. He set it on the bench and opened it under his headlamp. The first page was dated March of 1972. The hand that had written it was small and square and careful. First day on this bench. Old Judge Little handed me his pencil and said, "Sharpen it your own way," so I did, starting this book. I mean to write one line for every child that comes through this room. I mean to remember them, everyone, because somebody in this county ought to. H.W. Silas turned the pages slowly. They were full, top to bottom, year after year, line after line in pencil, names, dates, beside each name of a few words in a private shorthand he couldn't read, and beside some, small marks, a star here, a cross there, a single letter O, again and again hundreds of them marching down the margins like a thing the man could not stop doing. He didn't know what the marks meant yet. He only knew this. A man had sat in this room the better part of his life and written down the name of every frightened child who stood before him. He had done it in pencil, alone, where no one was watching. He had asked for nothing. Silas turned toward the back, not looking for anything, just looking. And then he stopped. There, in a hand grown slightly less steady, on a page dated April of 1995, was a line he could read without his lips moving at all. Crowder, Silas A., 42291. Beside his name was a star and a cross and the letter O. He heard the door behind him. Verla had come back, soundless, in her rubber boots. She was looking over his shoulder at the open book, at the name, and her face had gone the color of the old ledger paper. That was his book, she said quietly. He never let another soul touch it. Not in all the years I worked here. Whose? Silas's voice was barely there. Whose book? Verla looked at the line with his own name on it, written 16 years before he ever drove into Holland County. She was quiet a long moment. The creek ran on outside, and somewhere down the empty street a screen door banged in the wind. Hollis Wren, she said. Judge Wren. He sat that bench 37 years. And son, he wrote your name in that book the year you were 4 years old. Word of the courthouse got around the way things get around in a county where the paper comes out once a week and everybody reads it. The Holland County Beacon ran a piece that Thursday, 3 paragraphs and a photograph, under the headline, 20-year-old boys, Bathus for $5. The photo wasn't posed. The Beacon man had caught Silas up on a ladder, pulling ivy off the brass nameplate above the doors. A black and white Angray dog sat at the foot of the ladder, looking up at him. The dog had wandered in off the road behind Bo's salvage yard 3 days before, half-starved, ribs like a washboard, and had decided on its own that it lived with Silas now. Silas had not invited it. He had fed it a biscuit, and that had settled the matter. He called it Smoke for the color of it. Silas didn't think much about the article, but somebody 200 miles away read it. 3 weeks after it ran, a clean gray sedan came up the gravel and parked behind Bo's truck. A man got out who did not belong to Bramwell Creek. He was in his 50s, soft in the middle, in pressed khakis and a golf shirt, with sunglasses he didn't take off. He came up the walk, looking at the building the way Pruitt had looked at Silas, like he was already running numbers in his head. "You'd be the young man from the paper," he said. "Crowder, is it?" Lyle Burdick. He did not offer his hand. "I'm here about a mistake. The late Judge Hollis Wren was my cousin. First cousin once removed, but family's family. He passed his 2017. No will, no children. That makes me his next of kin under Kentucky law." He glanced up at the cupola, the brick, the long roofline. "I've spoken to an attorney. It appears the county sold property out from under his estate. We'll be filing to set the sale aside." Silas said nothing. He had learned that silence cost you less than words did, almost always. Verla had come out onto the steps, drying her hands on her flannel. She looked at Lyle Burdick a long moment. Then she said, flat, with the iron showing under it, "The courthouse never belonged to Hollis. It belonged to the county. The county sold it lawful at open auction, and this boy paid the price they asked. You know that, or your lawyer does." Burdick smiled the way Pruitt had smiled, the smile that started at the mouth and stopped there. "We'll let the court decide what's lawful, ma'am." He looked at Silas one more time, and something flickered behind the sunglasses. It wasn't quite greed, and it wasn't quite anything Silas could name. "There's money in this somewhere. There always is. A man doesn't leave a thing alone for 22 years for nothing." He got back in the sedan and backed down the gravel and was gone. Silas stood a while after the dust settled. "What do you mean?" he said. "Left it alone 22 years. Verla didn't answer right away. She sat down on the top step, slow, and Smoke came and put his head on her knee. She rubbed the dog's ears and looked out at the dogwood losing its blossoms in the wind. "You best come sit," she said. "There's things about that book I can tell you now, and things I can't, because I promised a dying man I'd let him tell you himself, but I can teach you to read his marks. You'll want to understand them before you understand anything else." That night Verla showed him the book by lantern light, the two of them on the bench with Smoke asleep at their feet. She put her finger on the 3 columns. "Case number here, what he found here, what he ordered here. Pencil for everything except the final order. The order he always wrote in ink." She tapped the column. "Pencil can be rubbed out. A man's life can't. He used to say that." She moved her finger to the margins, to the small marks. Star meant the child stayed with kin. Cross meant the child went to the state. He hated the cross. You can see it now he made them. See how he bore down, like he was sorry every time. Verla was quiet. That one he never explained to anybody. But I worked beside him 31 years, and I'll tell you what I came to believe. She turned a few pages. The O's marched down the margins, hundreds of them, more than the stars and crosses put together. I believe the O meant open. Meant he wasn't done with that one. Meant he'd lie awake on it. He'd close the case in the morning and carry it the rest of his life. She closed the book on her thumb. "He told me once near the end that a judge does 2 things. He decides, and then he remembers. He said the deciding was the easy part. He said nobody ever taught him the second part. He had to learn it one child at a time." Silas thought about that. 37 years, a line for every child. He did the arithmetic the way he counted ceiling stains, slow and sure, and the number it came to sat in his chest like a stone. "How many?" he said. "How many's he got marked O?" Verla opened the book again, and the two of them counted page by page. It took the better part of an hour. When they were done, the number was 1,247. Silas sat with it. 1,200 children a man had decided about, and then could not stop thinking about. For the rest of a life he spent alone in a brick building at the end of a gravel road, and one of those names on a page, dated the spring he turned 4, was his own. After Verla left, Silas stayed up with the book. Now that he could read the marks, he read them. Not his own page, the others. He wanted to know what kind of man had written his name. The entries were short, 4 or 5 words apiece, but they told you things if you sat with them. A boy in 1981 marked star with a note in the margin. Gave the grandmother my office number, told her call any hour. A pair of sisters in 1989 marked cross, and beside them, harder than the rest. State placement, separate counties, could not prevent. Wren had bordered that one with a thin black box, the way you box a thing you mean never to forget. Silas found a girl from 1977 marked with both a cross and 2 pages later, a star, as if the judge had gone back. He found the note, returned to Mother 14 mo later. Mother got clean. They do sometimes. He found a boy in 1993 marked O, with 3 words under the name that Silas read twice. Looked like Owen. He didn't know who Owen was. He turned the pages. It went on like that, year over year. A man writing down children the law had given him no good choices about, and writing beside each one the small private thing he had done or failed to do. Nobody had paid him to keep the book. Nobody had ever read it. He had filled it anyway, in pencil, alone for 37 years. He had told himself on the first day that somebody in the county ought to remember. Then he had made himself be that somebody. Silas closed it near dawn. He understood now that a judge's whole job was a thing nobody could see him do. The deciding happened in a public room. The remembering happened in this book and in a tin of pencils cut to the length of one man's hand, and in 1,200 marks no one had been meant to find. He found Maribel Carney the following week, through Verla, who knew everyone the county had ever employed. Maribel was 68 now and lived in Pikeville, in a house that smelled of cornbread and wood smoke. She had worked 30 years as the advocate the law sends to sit beside a child too small to understand what is being decided about them. She had sat beside Silas once, though he had been far too young to remember her face. She poured him coffee he hadn't asked for and studied him over the rim of her own cup. "He sent the Christmas cards through me," she said finally. "Every year. From the year you turned 5 to the year you turned 16 and aged out, and there was no address left to send to." She set the cup down. "He'd hand me an envelope, cash inside and a card. He'd tell me to pass it to whatever family had you that year, signed only, a friend of your mother's. He made me swear I'd never tell the boy who they came from." She was quiet a moment. "I kept that promise 11 years. I obeyed him because I trusted him, and because he was a hard man to refuse." Her jaw tightened. "I am not at all sure it was the right thing. A child ought to know who is loving him. I've thought about that a great deal, sitting here. I think about it still." Silas remembered the cards. He had not thought of them in years. A $5 bill at 5 years old, a 10 later on, once a 20 in a year that was bad. Always a few words in a square, careful hand, always unsigned. He'd assumed they came from the church or the state or no one. He had spent every dollar on food, and never once known there was a man behind them, sitting alone in a courthouse, choosing each card. He drove back to Bramwell Creek that evening with his hands tight on the wheel. Verla was on the courthouse steps when he got back, shelling beans into a bowl, smoke flat on his side in the last of the sun beside her. She looked at his face and knew where he'd been. "You want to know about your mother," she said. It wasn't a question. Silas sat down on the step below her. He didn't say anything which she took for yes. Vera was the smartest girl in that church choir, and the prettiest, and she knew both and didn't care about either. Verla worked the beans, her thumbs, splitting the pods clean. She could draw. Did you know that? Pencil drawings mostly, hands and faces. She drew your grandfather asleep in his chair so true you'd swear he'd wake up. Then she got hurt working at the poultry plant, 20 years old, and the doctor gave her something for the pain. And you know how that road goes in these hills. Everybody knows somebody who walked it. She set the bowl down. She loved you. I want you to hear that part plain, because the court record won't tell you. The court record tells you she lost you, and it's true, she did. But she'd carry you on her hip down to the store and tell anybody who'd listen that you had the Crowder jaw. Verla's voice didn't break. It just slowed. The thing that took her wasn't bigger than her love for you. It was just stronger that particular year. There's a difference, and I'd not have you confuse them. Silas looked out at the road. Where's she buried? Verla was quiet a moment. Pikeville, the county section behind the memorial yard. They put a marker, but it was the cheap kind, and they regraded that whole hill back in the 90s. She picked the bowl back up. I couldn't tell you now which stone is hers. I've looked. I'm sorry to say it, but I'd not lie to you about it. Silas nodded slow. He had learned a long time ago not to expect things to be whole. He filed it away, the not knowing, in the place where he kept the rest of it. The certified letter came that Friday, carried up the gravel by the mail carrier himself, because nobody in Bramwell Creek had gotten certified mail in years, and he wanted to see who had. Silas signed for it with the carrier watching. The return address was a law office in Lexington. He read it the way he read everything, slow, alone, sitting on the bench. Petition to set aside surplus conveyance. Pending action. Words he had to sound out and still didn't fully hold. But the shape of it came clear enough. Lyle Burdick was asking a court to take the courthouse back. He drove out to Bo's that evening and showed him the letter, because Bo was the only man he knew who'd dealt with lawyers and lived. Bo read it twice, slow, his lips not moving but his jaw working. "This here's a scare more than a sword," he said finally. He handed it back. "Your deed's clean. County sold it, lawful, you paid. It's recorded down at the clerk. A cousin twice removed can file all the paper he wants, but he's got to prove the county wronged the estate, and the county didn't. They wanted shut of this place. They'd have paid you to take it." He scratched smoke behind the ears. "What he can do is cost you. Lawyers, time, worry. He's betting you can't afford the fight and you'll fold." "I can't afford the fight," Silas said. "No," Bo agreed. "But there's a thing he doesn't know about you, and I only half know it myself." He looked at the young man a long moment. "You don't fold. I watched you clear that building with your hands when any sane man would have walked. Burdick's reading a homeless kid off a newspaper. He's not reading you." Silas folded the letter back into its envelope and put it in his coat, next to the deed and the flyer. It was getting to be a thick coat. That night he sat with the book alone, smoke breathing slow against his leg, the lantern throwing his shadow up the wall behind the bench. He turned to the page with his name. He put his finger on the star, the cross, the O. He understood the cross now. The cross meant the judge had sent him to the state, to the foster homes, to the years of shoes on first and counting ceilings. But the man had also marked him with a star, and the star was for the children who got to stay with family. That made no sense. And the O, the open mark, the one that meant a man would lie awake. Silas turned it over and could not make it fit. If you've stayed with Silas this long, through the auction and the biscuits and the 1,200 names a dead man couldn't put down, then stay with me a little longer. Because there is a door in that courthouse Silas hasn't opened yet. The one behind the bench, with the brass plate gone green. And what waits on the other side of it is the part of this story I have been waiting to tell you. Silas was about to close the book when his thumb caught on something stiff inside the back cover. The end paper had been slid along one edge and resealed. The cut was so neat he'd have missed it in daylight. He worked the knife in and slid it open, and a small brass key fell out into his palm, cold and bright, tied to a square of paper with a length of waxed thread. He turned the paper over under the lantern. 4 words in that same square, careful hand, the hand that had written one line for every child in Holland County for 37 years, for the one with the star. The key fit the lock behind the bench, the way a thing fits when it was cut for it. Silas stood at the door a while before he turned it. He had waited weeks already without meaning to. Some part of him had known the room was the end of something, and had wanted to be ready, and he was not sure now that a man could ever be ready. He turned the key. The bolt drew back with a sound like a held breath let go. The door opened on a small room. It was the only room in the building the weather had not gotten into. The roof held over it. The walls were dry. There was a desk and a tall chair behind it, and a coat still on a hook by the window, gone gray with dust but whole. The air smelled of pencil shavings and old wool, and under that faintly of a man. On the desk sat 3 things, set out in a row, the way you set things out for someone you are expecting. A photograph in a tin frame. A boy of about 4, fair-haired, squinting into the sun, holding up a fish too small to keep and grinning like he'd landed a whale. Silas looked at it a long moment. He did not know the face, but he knew the look. He had worn it himself, maybe, before he learned not to. The rest of the room held a man's small habits, kept the way a man keeps them when no one is watching. A wall calendar from 2017 still turned to October, the month he died. A pair of reading glasses folded on a thin book of Psalms. A coffee mug on the windowsill with its lid turned upside down over the top, the way Silas would later learn the judge always left it. Verla told him about that. Hollis Wren believed a cup stayed warm longer with the lid flipped down to trap the heat. He had done it every day for 40 years. No one had ever told him whether it worked or not. He had simply decided it did, and gone on. Beside the photograph, a small bank book, the cover soft with handling, and beside that a letter, sealed with one word on the front in the square, careful hand he had come to know better than his own. He sat down in the tall chair because his legs had stopped wanting to hold him. Smoke had followed him in and lay down across his feet, the way the dog did when the room felt wrong to him. Silas opened the bank book first because it was easier than the letter. It was a passbook from First Mountain Bank in Pikeville. The account was titled in full at the top of the first page, SC, Holland County Trust, 1995. The first entry was dated April of that year, $86. Then another, the next month, $40. Then another and another, every month down the page and on to the next, year after year, in a hand that grew less steady as the dates climbed toward the present. He turned to the last page. The final deposit was dated the autumn of 2017. The balance line under it read $284,419.17. Silas sat with the number until it stopped meaning anything, the way a word does if you say it too many times. Then he set the bank book down and picked up the letter and broke the seal and read it slow, his lips moving, alone in the dry room, with the dog warm across his feet. Silas, the letter began. If you have come this far, then someone in this county finally did right by me, and you found the book and you found this room. I have hoped for that and feared it in equal measure. A man wants to be known. A man is also a coward about it. I was both, and you should know that going in. I have watched you your whole life, in the only way I was able. I sent cards through Marable Carney every Christmas, from the year you were 5. There was never enough in them. I told myself a little was better than nothing, and I am still not certain I was right. Now I will tell you the thing I have owed you for 22 years. In April of 1995, you stood in front of my bench. You were 4 years old. You did not come up to the rail. Your mother could not answer the questions the law made me ask her, and she wept. You held the hem of her coat and watched me, and I had to decide what became of you. I decided you would go to the state. It was lawful. By the law I served, it was correct. I want you to hear that from me, because you will wonder and the wondering will eat you if you let it. I do not believe the ruling was wrong. I believe it was not enough. There is a difference, and I have lived inside that difference every day since. Here is what you could not have known. The summer before you came to my courtroom, in July of 1994, my son drowned in the pond behind my house. His name was Owen. He was 4 years old. After that, my wife could not stay in the world, and within 2 years she had left it too. I was a judge in an empty house, with a book full of other people's children. And then you stood in front of me, 4 years old, with your mother's eyes, and there is a thing I should have said in chambers that day, after I read your file, but the next case was already at the door, and I told myself there would be time. There was not time. There is a great deal I told myself there would be time for. I went home that night and could not eat. The next morning I drove to First Mountain Bank and opened an account with $86, which was what I had in my billfold. I have put money in it every month I have drawn breath since. It is yours. It always was. I marked your name in my book with a star, which in my private bookkeeping meant a child who stayed with family. You did not stay with your family, but you became mine in the only chamber where I was allowed to keep you, and a man's ledger is his own. The trust is set so that no one can take it from you. The lawyers in Pikeville have the papers. The building, if you have it, do something good with it. Do something kind. That is the whole of what I have ever asked of anyone, including the man in the mirror, who did not always answer. I loved you in the only way a man in a black robe is permitted to love a child he could not bring home. Do not waste it. Hollis Wren, the 1st of October 2017. Silas read it twice. Then he set it down on the desk and put his face in his hands. The dog lifted his head. Outside, the dogwood moved in the wind. For a while, the young man did not make any sound at all. He stayed in the chamber until the light was gone. Then he locked it back the way Wren would have wanted, and slept on the bench one more night with the bank book under his coat. He showed Verla the letter in the morning. She read it standing in the doorway with the light behind her, and when she finished, she folded it along its old creases and handed it back, and her hands were not quite steady. I knew most of it, she said. Not the boy, not Owen. He never spoke that name to a living soul, far as I know. She looked out at the sycamore. 31 years I sat outside that chamber door. I thought I knew the man. Turns out I only knew the judge. She wiped her face once quick, with the heel of her hand, and was done with it. Well, now you know what he was. The question is what you'll be. Silas didn't answer that. He wasn't sure yet. But the question went into him and stayed. Word of the trust did not stay quiet for long. Lyle Burdick heard of it the same week Silas did, the way such things travel, and his Lexington lawyer filed a second motion, this one asking the court to freeze the account pending review. That was when Verla drove Silas to Pikeville to see Frances Okafor. Frances was younger than Silas expected, maybe 40, with reading glasses pushed up in her hair and a desk buried under other people's troubles. She worked legal aid because somebody had to, and the pay was nothing, and she had stopped apologizing for her office years ago. She spread the chamber documents across the one clear corner of her desk and went through them slow, with a pen, making small marks of her own. "Here is what you need to understand," she said finally, taking the glasses down. "A trust is not a will. A will gets picked apart in probate, and any cousin with a lawyer can stick his hand in. A trust, set up right with a named beneficiary, passes the day the man dies, clean, to the person named. It never enters the estate. There is nothing for an heir to claim, because it was never the dead man's to leave. It was already yours from the day he signed it." She tapped the page where his name was typed in full. "He set this up in 1995, the same year he ruled on you. He used a lawyer in Pikeville who's dead now, but the firm kept the file." She looked at Silas over the desk. "I have seen a lot of people try to do a kind thing and do it sloppy, so the kindness falls apart the minute it's tested. This man did it like he built that courthouse. He did it to last." She put the glasses back on. "Burdick's got nothing, but he'll make noise and nosts. Let him, we'll be ready." Silas looked at the papers, at the careful work of a man 22 years dead, done for a 4-year-old who held the hem of his mother's coat. He nodded once. "All right," he said. "Let's be ready." Lyle Burdick's lawyer set the hearing for the second week of June. Silas did not sleep much the night before. He sat up with the book and the bank book and the letter laid out on the bench, the way they had been laid out for him in the chamber. He tried to think what he would say if they asked him to speak. He had never been good with words spoken out loud in front of people. He had always done better with a hammer or a broom than a sentence. Toward morning, Smoke got up and put his head on Silas's knee. Silas scratched the dog's ears and decided he would let Francis do the talking. There was no shame in a man knowing what he was not. Verla rode over with him in the borrowed truck. She wore her church dress, which Silas had never seen, and she held the canvas bag with the book in it on her lap the whole way and did not say much. Once on the long grade out of Bramwell Creek, she said, "He'd have liked that you kept his marks under that bench." That was all. She looked out the window at the hills the rest of the way. It did not happen in a courtroom. It happened in the records office at the new county. Out on the highway, the metal box Verla had no use for. The conference room had a long table and chairs that did not match. Garrett Pruitt came on behalf of the county. Lyle came with his Lexington lawyer, a young man in a good suit who looked like he had somewhere better to be. Silas came with Verla and Maribel and Beau and a legal aid attorney named Francis Okafor, who worked out of Pikeville and had taken the case for nothing when Verla called her. Lyle's lawyer spoke first. He spoke a long time. He used words like intestate succession and rightful heir. He laid out how Hollis Wren had died with no will and no children. That made Lyle Burdick its close living kin, the lawyer argued. And it meant the surplus sale of the courthouse, and any assets tied to the dead man ought to be reviewed by the court. Francis Okafor let him finish. Then she opened a folder. She laid the recorded deed on the table first. The county had sold the courthouse lawfully at open auction, she said, and Silas Crowder had paid the price the county set, and the conveyance was complete and recorded. The building had never been part of the Wren estate. It had belonged to Holland County. Pruitt, to his credit, nodded once. He could not argue otherwise without arguing against his own county. Then she laid out the trust. The account at First Mountain Bank was not an asset of the estate, she said, and slid the documents across. It was an irrevocable trust, established in 1995 with a single named beneficiary. She read the name aloud. Silas Allen Crowder, date of birth the 22nd of April 1991. The trust had passed outside probate the moment Hollis Wren died, the way such a trust is built to do, and no heir had any claim on it, none, not the closest kin in the world. Lyle's lawyer started to say something about the beneficiary designation. That was when Maribel Carney spoke. She had not been called on. She simply began in the level voice of a woman who had spent 30 years saying hard things in quiet rooms, and told them about the cards. 11 years of them. Cash and a few words passed through her hands to a boy who never knew. She had the carbon receipts the bank gave her for the cashier's slips, kept in a shoebox for 2 decades, and she set them on the table one at a time. He never missed a year, she said. Not the year his health went, not the year the ice storm took the power for 9 days. The man drove to my house on tire chains to hand me the envelope. He would not let the boy go without a card. She set down the last receipt. "I do not know what you came here for, Mr. Burdick, but I will tell you what your cousin did with the 22 years you say make you his kin. He spent them on a child he was forbidden to keep. If that does not make a family, I have wasted my whole life misunderstanding the word. The room got quiet. Then Verla reached into the canvas bag at her feet and brought out custody book 17 and set it on the table without a word, and turned it to the page that bore Silas's name. The star, the cross, the small letter O. She did not explain the marks. She did not have to. The book sat there, 100 years of children written down in pencil by a man who asked nothing, and even Lyle's young lawyer stopped writing on his pad and looked at it. Frances Okafor said one more thing, and then she stopped. She placed the letter on the table, and beside it a single sheet of county paper, a death certificate for a child named Owen Wren, dated the 14th of July, 1994. She did not read either one aloud. She only let them lie there where Lyle Burdick could see them. He picked up the death certificate. He read it, and then he read the letter, all of it, while the room waited and no one filled the silence. He was a soft man in a golf shirt, driven down from Lexington, certain there was money owed to him. Silas watched the certainty go out of him, line by line, as he read. When he finished, he set the pages down very carefully, the way you set down something that turns out to be heavier than it looked. He sat there a moment. Then he took out his pen and signed the withdrawal of his petition, where his own lawyer pointed, and slid it across the table. He stood and put on his jacket. On his way to the door, he stopped and reached into his billfold and laid a $1 bill on the table beside the deed. For the recording fee, he said. It was the only thing he said. He did not look at Silas, and he did not say he was sorry. He was not a man who knew how, and $1 laid down by a man like that said more than the word would have. He went out to his clean gray car and drove north, and Silas never saw him again, and that, in the end, was its own kind of mercy for them both. Silas drove back to Bramwell Creek alone that evening. He let himself into the courthouse and climbed the 3 steps to the bench and sat down on it the way Wren must have sat 10,000 times. Smoke came and lay at his feet. The light went long and gold through the hole in the roof and then went gray, and then it was dark, and Silas did not move to light the lantern. At 11:14, the coal train came through the crossing. The whole building hummed with it, the way it had the first night, the brass plate ringing faint above the doors and the floor trembling under him. Silas sat in the dark and let it pass through him. He did not cry now. He had done that in the chamber, with the dog and the photograph and the man's last words. This was something else. This was a man sitting in a room that had been built to hold him, finally still inside it. The train went on east toward the mountains, and the quiet came back, deeper than before. He thought about the man who had sat in this room before him, a man who went home to an empty house every night of his working life, and got up the next morning and did the work anyway. A man who had lost the one child the world let him keep, and had spent the rest of his years keeping, in secret, a child the world would not let him have. Silas had spent 2 years believing nobody had ever chosen him. He had been wrong about that the whole time, and the being wrong did not make him angry. It made him want to be worth the choosing. 14 months later, the dogwood at the foot of the steps came into bloom again. The courthouse had a roof now. Bo Halsey and a crew of men from 3 counties had set the new rafters over the winter, oak cut and seasoned the slow way. Silas had learned to swing a framing hammer all day and feel it in his shoulders at night. He had learned to call that a good kind of tired. It had been hard work and slow, and the way Bo ran it was the way Wren had built the place to begin with, which was to say without hurry. They cut the rafters from oak Bo had dried in his barn 2 years. They pegged the main joints the old way, with hardwood dowels and no nails. A nail rusts, Bo said, and a peg swells tight, and a building ought to outlive the men who raised it. They worked through January with their breath showing and their hands cracked. There were days the snow blew sideways through the open frame and they quit by noon. Silas did not mind those days. He had spent too many winters with no roof of his own to begrudge the work of putting one up. He had changed across that winter, though he could not have told you how. He stood differently. He looked men in the eye now when he spoke to them, which he had not done before. A boy with nothing does better to keep his eyes down, and he had learned that young, and he was unlearning it slow. He still read slow. He had stopped hiding it. Frances had told him, plain, that slow was not the same as stupid, and that half the lawyers she knew read fast and understood nothing. Something in the way she said it had let him set the old shame down. They had saved the old bench. They had cleaned it and oiled it and set it back where it belonged, and underneath, where no one would see it unless they knew to look, the 2 carved letters and the date remained. OW 794. Silas had told the crew to leave them. He had not told them why. The money had gone the way Wren asked, which was carefree, and into more than one thing. A part of it had made the building sound. A larger part of it had gone into a fund that would outlast Silas, drawing interest in an account at First Mountain Bank, set aside so that the work could go on after him, and a small part of it Silas had kept. Enough to live on, enough to stop running, which was the first time in his life he had been able to, and not a thing he took lightly. On a Saturday in April, the courthouse opened again. Not as a courthouse. The county had its metal box for that. The brass plate above the doors had been cleaned down to the bright metal. Holland County Courthouse, 1888. Below it a new sign, hand-painted by a man in Pikeville who did such work, read the Wren Legal Aid Office. Inside, where the bench still stood, there were now desks and chairs. There was a shelf of plain-language pamphlets about custody and tenancy, and the kinds of trouble that fall hardest on people with no money to fight them. Francis Okafor came down 2 days a week. A retired paralegal volunteered on Tuesdays. It was not much. It was a great deal more than the county had ever offered the people of Bramwell Creek, which had been nothing. By the front door, set into the sandstone at the height where a hand would rest, was a small brass plaque. It read Hollis Wren Holland County Family Court, 1972 to 2009, and under that, in smaller letters, he kept the open cases. Verla cut the ribbon because no one else was going to Arkview for the job. She did it without ceremony, snipping the thing with a pair of kitchen scissors and saying, "Well, there," which was the most she would allow herself in front of people. Maribel was there. Beau was there, scrubbed and uncomfortable in a clean shirt. Earl Combs, the postmaster, came. So did a handful of families Silas was only beginning to learn the names of. They were people Wren had quietly helped across the years, their stories surfacing now one at a time, like stones in a field after the plow. One of them was a woman named Della Hartsock, 60 now, who came up the steps slow on a cane and asked to speak to the young man who had bought the place. She told Silas that in 1979 Hollis Wren had kept her and her brother together when the state wanted to send them to separate homes 2 counties apart. She did not remember much of the hearing. She was 9. But she remembered the judge coming down off the bench, which judges did not do. She remembered him crouching to her height. She remembered him telling her that whatever happened, she and her brother would not be split, because he had decided it and he would see to it. He had marked them with a star. She had not known that until Silas showed her the page. She put her hand flat on the glass over the book and stood there a while, and did not say anything more. There were others. A man Wren had steered toward a relative instead of the state, a young mother, grown now, whose own mother had gotten her back because the judge had given her the time and the chance the law did not require him to give. None of them had known about the book. None of them had known there were 1,200 others. They learned it that Saturday, standing in a restored courtroom in their good clothes, and more than one of them had to step outside into the April light to gather themselves. Inside the door, in a glass case Beau had built from salvaged oak, lay Custody Book 17. It was open to the page that bore Silas's name, the line dated April of 1995, the star and the cross and the small letter O beside it. Silas had thought a long while about whether to show it. In the end, he decided a man's whole life's work ought not to sit in a drawer in the dark, the way it had for so long. Beside the old book in the same case lay a new one. It was cloth-bound, the same dull red, bought from a bookbinder who still made them that way. Its first page was filled in pencil, in a hand that was not careful yet, but was trying to be. Silas had written it with one of Wren's own pencils, sharpened down to the length of his hand. First day it read, "I mean to keep them too. The ones who come through this door with nobody behind them. I mean to write their names down so somebody in this county remembers." He left it unsigned, the way the cards had been, and then thought better of it, and added 2 letters at the bottom. SC. In the weeks after the opening, the office began to do what it had been made for. A widow came in about a lien on her late husband's truck. A man who could not read his own eviction notice came in. Silas knew exactly what that felt like. He sat with him and read it slow, and did not once make him feel small about it. Francis handled the law. Silas handled the door and the coffee, and the part where a frightened person needed somebody to tell them they had come to the right place. It turned out he was good at that part. He had been on the other side of that door his whole life, and he knew what it was a person needed to hear standing on the wrong side of it. That afternoon when the crowd had thinned, a boy came up the gravel on foot. He was 16 or so, too thin, in a coat that did not fit him, carrying everything he owned in a school backpack with a broken strap. He stopped at the foot of the steps and read the painted sign and then the brass plaque, his lips moving a little the way a person's do when reading his work. Silas knew that walk. He knew that coat. He had been that coat. He came down the steps with 2 cold bottles of water and handed the boy one and sat on the bottom step. Smoke went over and pushed his head under the boy's hand. The boy had been holding himself very stiff. At the dog's touch, he let some of it go. They did not talk much. There was not much that needed saying yet. After a while, the boy looked up at the building, the brick and the cleaned brass and the cupola, gone green with 100 years. "You hiring?" he asked, and tried to make it sound like he didn't care about the answer. "Maybe," Silas said. "Come back Tuesday, we'll see." The boy nodded and stood and shouldered his broken pack and went on up the road in the long light. Silas watched him go and did not call after him. Some things you cannot push. A door left open does more than a hand on the back ever could. There was one thing left that did not come right, and never would. A week after the opening, Silas drove to Pikeville, to the county section behind the memorial yard, where the markers were small and close together, and some had no names at all. He had a map the county had drawn up in the 90s, before they regraded the hill, and on it a plot was numbered for his mother. He found the number. The ground there held a stretch of grass with nothing on it. Whatever marker had been set was gone, taken by the regrading or the weather or the years between. The man at the county office had been honest enough to tell him the truth. They could not say for certain anymore which patch of ground was hers. Silas stood there a long time in the wind. Then he took from his pocket a sprig of dogwood he had cut from the tree at the foot of the courthouse steps. The white blossoms had already gone brown at the edges. He laid it down on the empty grass where the number on the map had said. It was the wrong spot, most likely. He laid it down anyway. A man does what he can with what he has left, and sometimes what he has left is only the trying. He drove home with the windows down and the creek running high beside the road. Verla was on the courthouse steps when he got back, shelling the last of the spring peas. Smoke lay flat in the sun beside her, the way the dog had taken to lying when the day was warm. She watched Silas climb out of the truck and come up the walk, watched the sea stood a moment at the bottom of the steps looking up at the building before he came on. "He's got Vera's stand," she said to no one, and went back to her peas. Inside, the light came down clean through the new roof and fell across the bench and the glass case and the 2 red books, the old one and the new one, side by side. A man had sat in this room for 37 years writing down the names of children so somebody would remember them. He had marked one of them with a star. He had kept him in the only place he was allowed to, and waited. For 20 years, Silas Crowder had believed he was a case the world had closed. He had been an open one the whole time, kept and carried and waited for. When I was writing this one, the detail I kept coming back to was the coffee mug. The judge flipped the lid upside down over his cup every morning of his working life because he believed it kept the heat in. Nobody ever told him whether it did. He decided it did. He did it for 40 years, alone. There are people doing things like that right now, all over this country. Not the visible kinds of good, the other kinds. The man who pays for a stranger's groceries at the register and tells the cashier to keep it quiet. The woman who has mailed a card every year for 14 years to a grandchild she was never allowed to meet. The neighbor who drives a boy to school every morning his father is in jail. The volunteer at the food pantry who remembers what brand of cereal each family takes. I am not going to ask you to leave a comment if you are one of those people. The work is not the kind that needs an audience. It is the most sacred part of itself. I am only going to use these last seconds to thank you, on behalf of every person who will never know your name. The names in the story have been changed. The county is not on a map. But you, if you are listening, are not imagined. You are still keeping the open cases, and you have not been alone in the work, even if you have always felt that way.